Welcome to the Total Wireless Store, where total confidence awaits.
I am done dealing with data overages.
Don't worry, you got this at the Total Wireless Store. Bring your number and get 15 gigs of data for $50 on the nation's best 4G LTE network. And during our 50% more data promotion, you'll actually get 22.5 gigs for the same price.
22.5 for 50? That's a gig deal.
Data it is.
Discover the Total Wireless Stores and get total confidence. The latest phones, the best network, all at great prices. Ends January 2nd, 2019. Excludes ports from TracFone Wireless Inc. brands. Terms at TotalWireless.com.
Welcome to Aquarian Radio. This is Karen Christine Patrick with Janet and Sasha Lesson. Today we have a really special show with Brien Foerster. It's titled Artifacts and Anomalies. And I'm very personally excited about talking to Brien Foerster today. I run a group on Facebook called the Earth Anomaly Research Society, and we feature a lot of his videos and discoveries on there on Facebook, just because the material is just so excellent. Let me read you an intro. Brien Foerster lives in Cusco, Peru, and is a foremost researcher on ancient Peruvian sites and artifacts. His work on the Paracas skulls, the elongated skulls, very famous, is groundbreaking, shattering conventional notions of human origins. Brien's site is hiddenincatours.com, where people can go to find out more about having a personal experience with living history, touring in such places as Machu Picchu, Lake Titicaca, and flyovers of the Nazca Line. Brien and his work has been seen on numerous media venues, such as Ancient Aliens, and in many highly educational quality videos that are shared in social media and in documentaries. By going on-site to these special places in the world, Brien and his team are able to show aspects of ancient science that are rarely featured in mainstream media. One of the reasons why we're having Brien with us today is he's going to be a presenter at Contact in the Desert, and we've been interviewing wonderful speakers and researchers that are going to be at Contact in the Desert. He's going to be there this year, and tonight he's sharing his latest doings with Aquarian Radio. And if you want more information about Contact in the Desert, it's contactinthedesert.com. And also want to remind you of hiddenincatours.com, hiddenincavideos.com, hiddenhumanhistory.com, all wonderful sites. It's just a wealth of information. And I'm hoping we have him with us. Janet, are you able to get a hold of Brien? Well, we're waiting for Janet to get a hold of him. I can tell you some of the things that I really love about his work.
I'm here. Sorry, I was on mute. Can you hear me? I was on mute.
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Sorry.
We have Brien with us.
Okay. No, not quite. I'm talking to him on Skype.
Okay.
He's waiting on Skype for me to call him, but I might have you and Sasha talk about this while I call him on Skype. So.
Okay, let's have Sasha have a comment.
Put your headphone on. You guys talk for a while. I will call Brien on Skype. Take it away, you guys.
Sasha, are you there?
Yes, you're live.
Oh, yes. Yeah, go ahead, Sasha.
About to have an interview with Brien Foerster, who's done the actual measurements and been on the ground many times in Tiwanaku, the place where Zechariah talked about General Adad and General Denerta building the alternate spaceport, getting ready for when they wound up nuking the space facilities in the Sinai. And this port had been developed by people that taught Yeshida and Adad and Denerta brought over from the Near East. And they built this whole series according to Sitchin, observatories and the takeoff from Nazca. And anyway, way before the ink all this stuff came down. I'm telling you, we were really lucky Brien on the show because he knows more about this stuff than anybody. Of course, we're very interested in the gate at Pumapuku where they have like friezes of the different kinds of skyfaring people that came through. Childress has said there's a gray there. There's long-headed people. Our history of the subterranean people.
Yeah, Sasha is there. We lost Sasha's audio. What I'd like to talk about is the forensic reconstructions of these elongated skulls. I think this is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And they basically, just like on CSI, if they're trying to figure out this skull that they find, who the murder victim was, they will do a forensic reconstruction. They used to do them with clay and sometimes with drawings and also now with 3D visualization. And several artists have done 3D visualization of these, what these beings would have looked like, when they were alive. And it's so incredibly real. I mean, you're literally seeing, ancient ancestors, ancient aliens, in the flesh, more or less. And you almost could see what they would look like if you just sat down and had a conversation with them. And, of course, history called this feature of these elongated skulls was they would take the babies and they would bind their heads when they're little, put them on some kind of cradle board and make their heads shaped into these shapes. But Brien has shown, and his research team has shown, that these are not, in fact, what created by this methodology. And I have to throw a personal note in here. They also suggested that these were deformed babies that grew up to adults that had hydrocephalus. And what most people don't know about me is that yes.
Okay, before the skulls, we're back. Sorry about that.
Yes.
I was just plugging in headphones and accidentally knocked myself off the air. Brien Foerster is here with us. Okay, so let's say yay. Sasha, say hi. He teleported all the way from wherever he is. Brien, sorry for the mix-up. I thought I had your phone, but you had given me a Skype. And on this show, we can't Skype. You have to Skype in. But welcome to the show, Brien. You're on with myself. I'm Janet Lesson, and Karen Christine Patrick, and Dr. Sasha Lesson. Welcome to the show, Brien.
Aloha. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear the aloha. I see, and we talked about it. You once lived in Lahaina.
That's right. I actually lived in Kahana, which is just north of Lahaina, but I've been visiting Hawaii since I was 12 years old.
Wow. Well, Sasha's been here, too. Sasha came to the islands in 1962, so he's been here longer than most everybody.
Wow.
So welcome to our show. We're all very excited that you're joining us here. I have you down for an hour, but if you can stay even like another, 15 minutes, 20 minutes or a half hour, we would. I'm sure we're going to need time. I'm so sorry we're a little bit late starting, but you can't. That's okay. We'll schedule you for a future time. But
okay.
Well, yeah. Welcome to our show. Karen did an intro, the one that talks about. You're living in Cusco, Peru, right now.
Both Cusco. Actually, we're just in Cusco now. We also live in Paracas on the coast.
Oh my goodness! How long have you lived there?
On and off for 6 years now.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research, so our listeners will have a better understanding of what we're going to talk about tonight, and then we'll put you kind of like on the warm seat, the hot seat, and the three of us will ask you questions. Okay?
Okay. Well, I've had a fascination with indigenous cultures since I was very young. I felt more comfortable with them, honestly, than I did with standard Canadian or American society. And so I began carving totem poles and things like that on the west coast of Canada starting at age 11. I became a professional sculptor in the native tradition at 25. And then when I was 35, I moved to Maui in order to help build the sister ship of Hokulea, the double hull sailing canoe. And after 2 years of that, then I explored Polynesia because I wanted to see all of Polynesia and connect with all of the different branches of the different families. And then one morning I simply woke up and heard the word Machu Picchu and Peru in my head. So I came to Peru and fell in love with this land.
Well, wonderful. Dr. Liston, he has his PhD in anthropology. So you were in the Pacific Islanders. Go ahead, speak.
Yeah, I did PhD in Tonga. That's not. But we're really interested in the area, the Machu Picchu area, for other students of Zechariah Sitchin's, and we've seen Jennifer Stein's slides of you there actually measuring stuff and seeing you on ancient aliens. But for Zechariah, the Tiwanaku and Pumapuka were there initially as part of developing a alternate spaceport in case Marduk got hold of the spaceport on the Sinai, and it was also the final getaway place going from Nazca, but it was also the importation of people that are called South American Indians, and Toth bringing them all the way down to Maya land. And we get pictures like Lord Palenque in a spacecraft. So we have this whole thing that Zechariah showed us, especially that Bolivian bowl that shows Sumerian writing and stuff. And so we got this whole story, and I'm looking to you to validate or expand. And one of the most intriguing things is the wall at Pumapuka that has what Chopras calls visitors, all the different from under, I guess from beneath the earth, from the inner earth, and from the skies. And I'd like to comment on that too.
Oh, okay. So where would you like to start?
Start with way before the Incas. What was there, and were the Anunnaki really the first people there? What do you think? And what happened that blew everything apart up there?
You mean in Nazca?
No, I mean up in the Pumapuka area where all the stones are just scattered all over, and like some terrible thing happened.
Yeah, well, actually, archaeologists really don't want to delve into, I would say, the reality of Pumapunku because they insist that the Bronze Age culture known as the Tiwanaku people arrived about 100 AD, constructed all of it, and then basically left the site at about 1000 AD. But they were a Bronze Age people and did not have the technology to possibly do the work. What I can say is that at least 90% of Pumapunku and Tiwanaku were removed over the course of 1,000 years between 1000 AD and presently by different cultures. What we know now is obviously that Pumapunku was struck by some kind of massive cataclysm. I'm just finishing up a book on that now, or writing it. And we believe that this cataclysm was global and happened 11,700 years ago. So that makes Pumapunku at least 12,000 years old.
So that's a coterminous with whatever happened to cause Noah's flood in some of the accounts. Is it the same disturbances?
Well, we know that Pumapunku was hit by some kind of tsunami because it was buried in at least 6 feet of mud. So the theory we have is that there was an explosion. Possibly there was an explosion of a volcano near Lake Titicaca, or because of this planetary cataclysm that happened about 12,000 years ago, that our planet shifted from being perfectly vertical to the present 23.5 degrees, and that would have thrown bodies of water, or at least the water in lakes such as Lake Titicaca to, create tsunamis. The force seemed to have come from the north. We also have evidence now using ground-penetrating radar that there are chambers underneath Pumapunku. So archaeologists are kind of afraid to dig deeper than they have, but we have evidence that much of Pumapunku was built on purpose underground.
Some of the accounts talk about Guanaco, which was the submarine port in the bottom of the lake. Do you have any? Do you see ruins or sound images of ruins down there?
Well, there are ruins actually on the east side. Lake Titicaca is actually two lakes that are become one. There's the northern lake is very deep. It's as deep as 1,000 feet, and then the southern lake is actually quite shallow. It's only about 30 feet deep, and we have seen by going on a boat, we have seen constructions of walls and things like that in the shallow part of the lake. So definitely there's a lot more that should be looked at by archaeologists, but they simply complain that they don't have enough money, etc., to look at that. But also geologically speaking, we know that about 10 to 12,000 years ago, the lake level was 100 feet higher, and so since that was the case, the shore of Lake Titicaca was Pumapunku at that time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Is it just a lack of funds, or is there some kind of reason that people don't want the pre-Incan civilization to be recognized?
I think they honestly don't want to rewrite history, and I find it foolish. You get the same thing going on in Egypt. We have obvious evidence of pre-dynastic cultures that had sophisticated high technology, and yet Egyptologists refuse to accept the sheer evidence or the mountain of evidence that there is. So I think it's kind of the same case in both Peru and Bolivia. They try to say that the megalithic work was done by the Inca or the Tiwanaku people, but that's clearly impossible.
Got it. And the thing that one of my listeners was really bugging me about to understand was, how did they get the metal clamps or the metal into place in the blocks? How would a person how would that be done?
Well, you see two different techniques involved. One of them is that the stone was actually chipped out, and then a sheet of bronze would be cut of the right shape to insert it. But there are other obvious examples where they had to melt the bronze itself and pour it into the recesses. And, you're talking 13,000 feet in altitude. You can't do that with a simple fire. That requires a furnace. So that is something else they don't want to look at.
Wow. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Karen has some questions.
Yes, hello, Brien. It's great to talk to you. I was talking before we got you on here about the Paracas schools, and just a personal insight that I have about that, because I happen to be a parent of a hydrocephalic child. So that was one of the things that they said about the Paracas schools, that these were hydrocephalic children, and then they somehow headbound them, and then that's what created this elongated school structure. And I knew right away that was kind of hogwash, because you have these adult, members that you have their schools, and hydrocephalic children with that bad of, that volume of fluid, the intracranial pressure, they wouldn't have survived childhood. So I knew there was something fishy about that whole thing. And I also want to say that the reconstructions that your team and other artists have done is just breathtaking. So if you could talk a little bit about the school, that's just an amazing story to me.
Sure. Well, we've had at least 20, if not 30, doctors, nurses, dentists, and other health professionals, come here to Peru and physically inspect the skulls, and not one of them has said that it was hydrocephaly. They said that hydrocephaly would create almost a beach ball shape or a round head, and that these clearly, that many of them are the result of cranial deformation that was done to newborn children, but there are other examples that are so natural in shape that none of these medical professionals could explain what kind of head binding could possibly create that design, because they honestly said they look like they were born that way. And so there are other features of the skulls which don't make sense in terms of normal Homo sapiens skull shape. One is the eye sockets in some cases are 50% larger than normal, and also there are 2 holes in the back of the skull called foramen, and that is for nerve and blood flow, and those holes are not present in normal human beings.
Did you have skeletons that went along with the skulls? So were you able to ascertain the body size along with it? Were they giants, basically?
Well, the problem is that most of the skulls that we have in our museum here are the result of tomb robbers, basically bringing them to the museum to either donate or sell them. And the bodies themselves, or the skeletons, are generally destroyed because since they're bound in fabric when they're buried, the tomb robbers tend to tear the skeletons apart looking for rings and bracelets and other ornaments. We have used the femur in order to judge the general size of these people. Peruvians, even in present day, have a tendency of being quite short, like on average maybe 5'4", and we found that some of the Paracas 2,000 years ago were 6 feet to 6 feet 2 tall.
And the DNA results have been very fascinating too. And I don't know if you know too much about the Star Child skull, but that was, there was basically, we're kind of knocking down the door of what we've known about human DNA. What's the latest on that aspect?
Well, I was fortunate to be reasonably close with Lloyd Pye, who was the caretaker of the Star Child skull. And as you probably know, there are 25 chemical and physical characteristics of the Star Child that make it not human, or at least not related to us. The most astonishing example is the fact that the bone material of the Star Child skull is closer to tooth enamel than it is human bone. And Lloyd was fascinated by the elongated skulls. We did have some initial testing done about 3.5 years ago by one laboratory, and the results that came back were that there were certain segments of the DNA that didn't match anything that was modern human, known to be ancient human, primate, or even mammalian, which was kind of odd. But the unfortunate thing is that the geneticist was doing this kind of under the table, and when his boss found out, he fired him. But more recently, and actually within the last month, we've had 2 results come up from 2 different skulls, and both of them show that their ancestry, or at least part of their ancestry, does not come from people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge. So there is a genetic component of the Paracas and this other elongated skull that indicate that at least part of their ancestry is not Native American.
It's interesting, the reconstructions are like when they're trying to do the facial features, and I know they even did some of the face painting and what potential cultural, artifacts were. Was that something that was just kind of estimated from the culture that they're in Peru, or was there some other insight or other artifacts to help determine? Of course, grave robbers would have taken any jewelry, for sure, but was there any other cultural indications that were used in the reconstructions, which people need to check those out? They're really fascinating. So that was my question, and then I'll pass to someone else after that.
Okay. Well, actually, all three artists who have done quite extensive work. There's Marcia Moore, who has done three-dimensional computer animations of the Paracas. Then there's Marc Laplume, who has done, I think, 4,000 drawings. And then others have contributed, and all of them have said that just based on looking at the skeletal shape and what the face looks like on the skulls, they don't appear to them to be what one would call 100% Native American. They see Caucasian characteristics involved, especially the nose, and the eyes seem to be larger. So I think from what we've been able to figure out so far, the Paracas seem to be of very complex genetic background. It's very probable that part of their ancestry comes from another part of the world, possibly the Middle East, but we also can't rule out the idea that there were ancient bloodlines that possibly died out, that hopefully we'll be able to find of smaller populations of subspecies of humans that arrived maybe in the Paracas area because they were being attacked in their homeland and had to escape by ship. And when they reached the Paracas coast and found basically no one there, they decided to set up their civilization undisturbed.
Great, thank you.
Sasha,
My pleasure.
Sasha, you want to ask some questions?
Just in situ, there's a guy came, I think it was Moon Lab or something like that. He had a green stone, and which usually means a computer, the Sumerian stock, who took his followers in boats across. And before that, the so-called South American Indians shouldn't be anything like the North American Indians, or very little, because if Sitchin's hypothesis is correct, because what he says is that Hadad and Ninurta and Ptah all brought across their work crews of Africans, West Africans, and of course Nigerians, and Middle Easterners, and the descendants of Kayin who were living in Southeast Asia. And these were brought over by boat and by plane. And what do you think of that as an alternative hypothesis for the people in Paracas Bay? That's Hadad's symbol, according to Sitchin.
Yeah, well, the one thing I could definitely say is that the idea that everyone who populated North, Central, and South America, they couldn't have all come across the Bering Land Bridge. That's actually making these ancestral peoples really stupid, that they couldn't figure out how to build a boat. And we're getting ample evidence now that there have been crossings across the Pacific through Polynesia, including ancient populations in Polynesia that were not the so-called Polynesians, but older races that lived there, especially Easter Island, for example. We also have evidence that, or there's actually new evidence that there are tribal people in Brazil who are closely related to Aboriginal Australians. More information that people made it to Peru going up the Amazon, because once you get to the headwaters of the Amazon, you're basically in the highlands of Peru. So that's a main artery to get to. And then there are other indications of movements of people from Australia across to Patagonia and then moving north. So I think the whole history of the Americas is very complex in terms of migrations over the course of several thousand years from several different directions. The one that intrigues me the most is the Middle Eastern connection.
Yeah, did you take a look at that bowl in Bolivia that had the symbols and had Assyrian writing on it?
Yeah, that's it's called the Fuente Magna Bowl. It's made of sandstone, and it was found quite close to the shore of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia in 1960, I believe. And the interesting thing about it is that it has Proto-Sumerian inscription, but it also has Tiwanaku culture inscription. So it's like a blending of different cultures.
Wow.
The unfortunate thing is, so far it's the only artifact that's been found, but it's in a museum called the Precious Metals Museum in La Paz on public display. But you're not allowed to take photographs of it. But of course, if you hide in the corner with a cell phone, that works.
That sounds good. Janet, here are a couple questions. Have you found any relation or correlation with Akhenaten and those people that had the elongated skulls? And I wondered also, is there evidence that can this species breed with regular human beings? And what happens if a human woman is carrying a child with such a large skull? Is she able to give birth to it naturally? Does she have to do it cesarean? Do you have any kind of research or evidence or stories of those kind of connections and evidence, information?
Yeah, actually, they found that at least cranial deformation has been practiced on 6 of the 7 continents. No one's been found in Antarctica for probable reasons, but there were many cultures in many parts of the world who did cranial deformation intentionally. It was always the royal class of a society. They obviously wanted to make themselves look different from the general population. And the 3 characteristics, when there is oral tradition relating to it, the 3 basic facts that we can figure out for why they did this is, number 1, they thought it made their children more intelligent. Number 2, they felt it was aesthetically pleasing to do this. And number 3, that's what the ancestors looked like. And so in regards to Akhenaten, his story is really fascinating. And he's the subject of the book I've just started to write, because he was definitely a member of the Egyptian mystery schools. And he knew a lot about the ancient history of Egypt dating well back before dynastic times. And this is why he kept giving hints in the artwork, because no one has truthfully found Akhenaten's body, nor that of Nefertiti. But it seems that what he was doing is he was hinting that his ancestors were elongated-headed people, and that's why he made the inscriptions all over the walls of himself and also his daughters of looking, having very elongated skulls. That was their ancestry that he was trying to tell people. The story of Akhenaten is very, very complicated and fascinating too.
Well, they were supposed to also have 6 fingers and toes on each hand. But have you found any evidence of that? Any skeletons?
No, so far only depictions, but one researcher, L.A. Marzulli, who's studying the giants of North America, when he was on Catalina Island, there's a little museum there, and he was allowed access to their archives. And in the archives, he found a photograph from the 1930s that it could not have been retouched. And the skeleton that they unearthed was 9 feet tall and had 6 fingers on each hand.
Okay. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Karen, in between, is there anything you want to convey to our listeners that we might not be touching on?
Actually, no. I'm open to discussing anything. One thing I also found in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh well, I'm fascinated by the period where after Ningishita Quetzalcoatl had settled in the Valley of Mexico at Teotihuacan, and somewhere coming down from the north were peoples that forced the Chichens the Toltecs to leave and become the Chichens at Chichen Itza. And basically there was this retreat of the Black Mayan princes and the Sumerian Middle Eastern types that thought that ruled my area with until they retreated all the way back to Central America, and they fought their last battles in South America, and then they were wiped out. And I'm fascinated by this scenario, partly because some of my informants tell me that's when a lot of the Anunnaki royal family got killed in their internecine wars. I just like your feedback on that scenario.
Yeah, that's really interesting because a recent book I wrote deals with these indigenous stories, and they are oral tradition about these light-skinned people of high intelligence who are bearded, who appear, and you find them in South America and Central America and Mexico. In South America, in general, these ancient people are called the Viracochas or the Viracochans, and they are said to have come from the east and were great teachers. They taught all the arts and sciences. They were tall, they were light-skinned, they were bearded. And then as you go up into Colombia and Ecuador, you find the same story of these ancient teachers. Then when you get into Central America, you get into the story of Kukulkan, who was called the plumed serpent. And again, he or they were regarded as these teachers from a distant land who were instructors. And then, of course, when you get to Mexico, you have Quetzalcoatl. So in all of these cases, they're regarded as being the plumed serpent. And if you look at what that symbolism means, at least in the Inca world and this part of South America, there were three major animals that were used as symbols. The serpent represented the subconscious mind, the puma or jaguar represented the conscious mind, and usually the eagle or the condor represented the superconscious. So I think what Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, and Viracochan were these people of incredible mental capability who had the subconscious, conscious, and superconscious in such tight, woven way that's why they were regarded as being the great teachers. In some stories, they left promising to return. In other stories, they were chased out of the territory after a certain period of time. And finally, if you're into energy lines and things like that, there's a thing called the Path of Viracocha, which is where we find all of the megalithic structures in Peru and Bolivia. At each one of those sites, we find elongated skulls. And if you follow the Path of Viracocha northwards, it goes straight through the locations where Kukulkan and and also then straight through Mexico City. So all of these people could have been the same people or descendants of the same people.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Karen.
Yeah, something I got particularly excited about recently. I know there's a lot of different ancient, sites on Facebook. I've got a group of about 5,000 people it's called the Earth Anomaly Research Society, and stuff from your videos and stuff like that we just discuss a lot on our site. I'll have you know. It was something that came up recently was the Saqqara artifact that they called a vase, but for all the world looks like a fan, modern day fan. And what I got real excited about, I've known about it a while, but somebody apparently has reproduced it with a 3D printing technology. And I thought that was kind of cool for, exploring artifacts, because then you could play with them and their shapes and what are they without damaging them the original in any way. But, this person 3D printed one of these and was playing around with it to see, what was it capable of doing. But that is one of the most interesting artifacts. If it's anything that looks like a technological, modern kind of thing, right, it's that particular artifact. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Sure.
That was one of actually 30,000 artifacts that were found in one cache at Saqqara, I think in the 1930s. And it was found broken, but there were other disc-like things that were found that were broken, and somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 bowls and plates and vases that were made of hard stone and had to have been turned on a lathe. So that would require diamond tools. And what you're discussing is called the schist disc, and we were recently in Egypt, and fortunately now you're allowed to photograph in the Cairo Museum. So we had a geologist with us, Susan Moore, and she's convinced now that the stone that it was made from is not schist at all, because schist is actually very fragile. She thinks that it's some kind of possibly slate that's super dense, and so it would have an incredible resonance to it. It would almost be metallic. The other odd thing is that it has these fan blades, but the blades are not at an angle, so it wouldn't either push or pull air or water, but it would probably set up some kind of vibratory field. What is amazing about it is that it's actually on display, because we very much presume that there are many artifacts that the museum does not have on display that represent aspects of lost ancient high technology, and they will not be put on display because they don't fit with the standard dynastic Egyptian story. But the fact that disc is still there, and it's quite big. It's about 3 feet in diameter. The fact that it's still on display is really intriguing. The unfortunate thing is that the models that have been made are smaller, and they're made out of plastic. So even spinning them, they wouldn't create the right resonance or vibratory field as the original material would.
Oh, that's very interesting. So if someone wanted to see these things that weren't on display, what kind of process would that involve? And has anybody, to your knowledge, been able to go in and see some of the hidden stuff?
No, I think the higher officials in the antiquities department in Egypt, through foreign pressure from the foreign archaeologists who are, some of the experts on the dynastic Egyptians, I think they've basically been forced to put these things in boxes and put numbers on them and keep them away from anyone researching them. The classic example, of course, from movies is Spielberg's Indiana Jones, where the Ark of the Covenant is put in a box and, never to see daylight again. And we honestly believe that there are thousands of artifacts that are being hidden away on purpose that no one may ever have access to.
What is the purpose? And what is to gain by this hiding of artifacts, and the fact that our civilizations have been influenced by extraterrestrials and probably inner-Earth peoples too? I don't see what the Great Fear is ultimately about. So what if everybody knows?
Well, the basic story is that for example, with Egypt, they insist that the dynastic Egyptians were more or less the first people there. They showed up around 3100 BC, and they disappeared during the time of the of the Romans, about 300 AD, and so that's their stuck time frame. And to throw in artifacts that may be 10,000 or 20,000 years old upsets their apple cart, but they're not able to. But they're not able to hide it anymore, because we're finding artifacts that don't match their time frame. We're finding artifacts that could not have been made by the dynastic Egyptians nor the Incas. So quite rapidly, they're losing their capability of trying to hide information, because as soon as we make a discovery, it's on the internet and around the world at the speed of light.
Right. So do you think there will come a time when they start bringing these things out from, first of all, what keeps them from destroying it, and are they destroying things rather than just hiding them deep underneath museums? And if they are hiding them rather than destroying them, do you have any inkling as to why they're doing that instead of getting rid of the evidence altogether?
Well, I think, it would be an international crime if they destroy the actual artifacts. I think most of them are just hidden away, and my hope is that new generations of open-minded academics will not have this, be looking through history with blinders on, and will start to open these things up and begin to entertain the idea that humanity, sophisticated humanity, is much older than what we've been taught in school. That the books have to be rewritten. That's why I'm doing the work that I do, and that at least the concept of things like Atlantis were real. It's just they were written down in poetic form, and so you have to decode the poetry in order to establish the actual reality. But I'm very hopeful, and that's what I try to do with everything I do, is just expose the new data to the world, to whoever wants to look at it.
In a way, it's ultimately a form of ethnocentrism to think that our current civilization of the last 10,000 years or whatever is the apex of evolution, and that it's humbling for people sometimes to think of themselves as being part of a much larger system. Well,
exactly, and a case in point being all of this, all these concepts of free energy that are attempted, to be brought to, into our world, to save our planet from the stupid way we do things, and the condemnation and destruction of people like Tesla, who reinvented ancient processes. That's the kind of stuff that we're looking at in ancient Egypt, is that they had forms of technology that were not harmful to the earth. They understood the processes of physics on a much deeper level than we did, and they simply utilized the powers of the universe in order to do things like possibly create electricity, transmit sound and energy without disrupting the ecosystems, etc. So, now is the time for all of this stuff to come back and be not be invented, but be reinvented, because clearly the super ancient ancestors were far more intelligent than what we are, and made much more better decisions than the way we do things.
What kind of technology was used to move around those giant stones on top of the Andes? What chemical and electrical processes did you find that?
I honestly believe it was anti-gravitational in some way. I'm not sure if they were able to levitate them, but they were able to neutralize gravity. It's possible that they had the capability of focusing energy on particular minerals, such as maybe quartz crystal in the case of granite, or andesite, and by neutralizing the gravity, they were able to move this material around as if it was styrofoam. Also, they would have to have some kind of sonic or vibrational technology to be able to cut the stone in the first place. So what most people find hard to believe is that the stuff that we're looking at, the megalithic work we're looking at, was done using technology beyond our capacity. It's not a question that they were as good as us; they were better than us.
Way better.
Mm-hmm, yeah. I'm looking at a chart of Janet. I'm looking at a chart of skeletons that have been found over the years, and the tallest was 36 feet high. Carthaginians uncovered 2 during the earthquake, and then of course Goliath was 10'6". It has a whole range. Have they uncovered? Have you seen or know of skeletons as tall as 36 or 25 feet high, 19 feet high, 20 feet high? What's the tallest skeleton that you've heard of or seen yourself? I guess that's my question.
Well, actually, most of the accounts, at least in North America, of the so-called giants who battled with the Native Americans and lost, they're spoken of as being 8 feet or possibly 9 feet tall. So I think that's possible. Of course, there have been hundreds of accounts, especially in the late part of the 19th century, documented in many parts of the United States, more than anywhere else in North and South America, of giants' bones being dug up, and then the people who found them contacting local museums, who then contact the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian sends people out, gathers the bones, takes them back to the Smithsonian. They're never heard from again. But the great thing about modern technology, is I know people who are active at looking for mounds that may contain large skeletons, often on Native American property. And so if they're able to get permission from the Native American people, then they can conduct digs without consulting the U.S. government, and then they can immediately document what they find and immediately put it on the internet.
Good. So we have a way to get around these people that hide them. There was a story, I don't know if you heard it, about 10 years ago now, that they uncovered a whole group of giant red-headed skeletons here in Haleakala in Maui. Have you heard anything about that one? And of course, it was quickly removed, and the cave was cemented in.
Yeah, actually, the amazing thing about the history of Polynesia in general is there are these stories, whether you're in New Zealand, which is Aotearoa, or you're in Tahiti or Hawaii or Easter Island, of at least one race existing there prior to the generally known waves of Polynesian people, that these people were quite tall and had genetically red hair. They probably integrated to some degree with the populations that came afterwards. But from my research, the so-called Menehune people of Hawaii were not these small people at all. The translation of Manahuna, which is from the Tahitian, actually means those of little power, meaning physical power. So it seems like the Tahitian wave, when it moved through the islands, basically destroyed these people or integrated with them, because the Tahitians were very ferocious warriors. The original inhabitants, who also were called the Mu, were supposedly very peaceful, psychic agriculturalists. So the whole red-haired story of Polynesia is very fascinating.
Karen or Sasha, who's got a question?
I can go.
Go ahead, Sasha. Look.
This story that Chief, people say you're saying that when our ancestors came from Tahiti, people to the Marquesas were party here. And they didn't fight us. They welcomed us and made a big party for us, their chiefs.
Well, it's, I base my whole knowledge of the Polynesian world on the elders who talk to me. The standard archaeological story is quite dry and boring and incomplete, because if you go to Aotearoa, which is New Zealand, some of the people there say that their ancestors came from Easter Island. They didn't come from Tahiti. There's a lot of evidence, actually, because Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, was called the Land of Weeping Waters. And recently, there's a Maori lady on New Zealand who had her DNA tested, and something like 25% of her DNA was Middle Eastern, and she had the oral tradition that said that her, this one branch of her family originally came from the Middle East and then passed through Polynesia and also passed through Easter Island, to get to New Zealand in the first place. So to some degree, it's very controversial, because some Polynesian people don't like to believe that they have ancestral DNA that dates much, much farther back and is more complex. But many of the oral traditions that I've studied say that, the Pacific area has been populated for many thousands of years prior to, the standard story of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago.
Yeah. Karen, go ahead.
Karen.
Yes, I was really delighted to find out that you've got a boat building background, because I lived on boats for about 7 years and got into maritime history. And I'm really amazed at how our modern interpretation of history does not give, our ancestors credit for how much journeying that they did by boat. And your knowledge of the Polynesian story and the Moose story is really interesting, because you absolutely know for sure that they had very large canoes and journeys, journals of journeys and stories of journeys that were, trans-Pacific, transatlantic. That's one of the things happening with DNA mapping, is that they are in fact finding out those connections that you're talking about, where you'd expect to find everything to be hyper-localized DNA, families, but instead it really does show that our families, for whatever reason, because of cultural reasons or because of climate change issues, literally travel all over the world. And of course, naturally, it would have mostly been by boat, because that's pretty much the easiest way to travel. So if you could talk about that a little bit more, I think that's very interesting.
Well, sure, because, again, having respect for indigenous people since I was a child, I would say, and it's really silly that some academics believe that the Tahitians found Hawaii because they were fishermen that got blown off course. These people were they were the master mariners of the Pacific Ocean. They didn't need to have a compass. They didn't need to have a watch or a clock, because they knew how nature worked. And I think the funniest story is that when they built Hokulea, which was, done more as a scientific expedition than anything else, and I believe they made it from Hawaii to Tahiti in something like 34 days. When they went back to Hawaii, one of the Hawaiian elders came up to them because they pushed the canoe really far east in order to catch the trade winds and not get blown off course. And this elder, when they came back, he said, interesting course that you took, but why didn't you use Keala I Kahiki Channel? And they said, well, what does that mean? And he said, the way to Tahiti.
Ooh.
So the next time they took Hokulea, they were able to cut something like 4 days off, because they simply used the natural winds and currents. And there's also growing evidence that there has been movement from Polynesia to the coast of Peru and back and forth over the course of thousands of years. It could be that the Paracas people with elongated skulls were related to the early people of Easter Island, because when I was there and brought a scale model of one of the elongated skulls, one of the elders said, oh, those people used to live here too.
Wow. So the Moai, most people don't know the Easter Island heads, if you keep digging down far enough, you actually find that they've got bodies attached. The Moai, were they, they're not just some kind of, idol to some kind of this godlike figure, that they were actually replicas of something that the islanders had actually seen. And there was some debate, too, of these small necklaces that the natives wear were tiny figures of another species that they were aware of that was just on the other end of the scale of size, super small humanoid-type beings. What can you tell us about those people, those other kinds of visitors to the island?
Well, again, the history is quite complex. You have two different styles of Moai. And as you said, none of them were created just as a head. Each one is the head with the full body. Sometimes the heads were broken off for various reasons, but there are more than 900 Moai on Easter Island, and they vary in size from about 6 feet tall to about 35, I think, to 40 feet tall. I was there with Dr. Robert Schock, who's a geologist that was able to date the Sphinx's erosion in Egypt at least 10,000 years. He's a stone erosion specialist. And so what he sees on Easter Island is two different cultures. There were the Polynesians who arrived somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, and then a much older culture that he said could date back to 12,000 plus years ago. And he found 4 different sites on Easter Island that had the same kind of level of technology in terms of megalithic building as we find in Peru. So again, you have super ancient inhabitants on Easter Island at one point, and then more recent arrivals after that.
Would the fact that they're buried up to their necks indicate possible cataclysm issue, that maybe some kind of tsunami activity or something, that literally they were maybe standing upright before and then they were buried in some kind of mud and some kind of catastrophe?
Well, that's actually Dr. Schock's belief. You know, some people think that they were buried on purpose, but he, you know, again, being a geologist and an erosion specialist, he said that over the course of 12,000 years of just gradual erosion plus catastrophic damage, that they could, you know, some of them have been found fully buried underground, and other ones are up to their necks, or, you know, at least half buried. So he thinks that they could be 12,000 or more years old.
Well, that's great. I'll pass it to someone else. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sasha, I wanted to know, what are you going to talk about at Contact in the Desert, which is coming up in a few weeks, the first weekend of June? What's your focus for that event?
I'm giving 3 talks. The first one is about the phenomenon of cranial deformation found around the world, documenting where, you know, in what societies and cultures this happened. Another talk is about the lost ancient technology of Peru, Bolivia, Egypt, and Baalbek in Lebanon. And then the third one focuses on the elongated skulls of Peru and Bolivia, talking about how far back in time they go and their relationship with the megalithic structures.
Fascinating. Sash.
That's good. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think we're about out of time. What else would you like our listeners to know? They can register at contactinthedesert.com. Anything else you want to tell our listeners before we end today's show?
I'd just like to thank you very much for this opportunity. You know, I've been fascinated by ancient cultures all my life, and I'm glad that at this point in my life I'm able to be on shows like yours in order to be able to share what I've learned, and I look forward to learning much, much more in different locations, and also from the indigenous people who wish to share what knowledge they want to with me, so that I can help to spread the fact that, you know, indigenous people have all over the world have very rich knowledge, and we should respect them very much with who they are and who their ancestors were.
One more thing before we go, and I'll give Karen a chance. We have somebody on hold. Let me see if they have a question for you. Area code 407. Do you have a question for Brien?
Yeah, this is Reverend John Polk. John Polk. How are you, Brien?
Hi, John. I didn't know.
Hey, everybody.
You might join us. What would you like to ask Brien before we let him go?
He answered it, actually. It was about the skulls, specifically in Peru, but I wanted to mention that I followed his work on ancient aliens in Pumapunku all throughout Peru, A Brief History of the Incas, brilliant book. And, he's on to something, absolutely, especially with the skull research. I find it completely fascinating. So, Brien Foerster, Reverend John Polk, I've been listening to about half of the show, and you're masterful in your niche in this field, and I've learned a lot from you.
My pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Sharon, any final words for Brien or for the listeners?
Oh, just, you provided so much wonderful information for the group that I have. We love discussing it, and we have a lot of people who know absolutely nothing about this stuff, so they get quite shocked. It's a big surprise, getting their eyes open. And I just want to know a little bit more about your Akhenaten book. I'm very interested in that. And I guess my final question is following up on the daughter of Akhenaten, Queen Skota, who is ostensibly part of the royal line of the Scottish people. I was just wondering if you're going to have some of that information in the book.
Yeah, I'm actually only 30 pages into the book now, so I'm going to spend several months trying to get hold of as much information about Akhenaten as possible and his family, because I find him the most fascinating of all the pharaohs.
Yeah,
I do
so
too. So that's exciting.
than all the others. He's like a mystery. He looks like that, and everybody else looks differently, or at least the depictions are. So, was he one of them? Was he another species of aliens that came down? Are the Anunnaki and the Akhenaten type people a different race, different race of the same species, or a different being altogether? So we have all these questions. So I hope you find all those things out for us and put those things in the book.
Well, the great thing about Akhenaten compared to the rest of them is that the rest of the pharaohs seem to be really arrogant, and they wanted these monumental carvings done of them, with big muscles and stuff. And he supposedly told his sculptors, "Portray me as I am." So he was obviously self-confident.
Mhm. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's all we have for today, and we do appreciate you, Brien, coming to our show. And Dr. Leslie and I are going to be at Condactin Desert, and perhaps we'll be able to come over and say aloha to you. So thank you for coming on today. And I think that's it for today. Anybody else? One last chance?
Thank you very, very, very much. This is a chance to get to the real history of humanity and our oneness, and to realize that we're part of a larger galactic family, and to break the miasma that we've been in for this academic sort of straitjacket that's descended over the world. And Brian's a major force in getting rid of this straitjacket.
So, Brien, thank you so much for your hard work and all the books you've Are they all on Amazon.com?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so your Brien is spelled Brien, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's Foerster, Brien Foerster, correct?
That's correct. Correct.
And if they Google you or if they search for you on Amazon, you have how many books now? 17 books or something?
Actually, 18, and the 19th is about to be published.
Amazing. Thank you for your huge volume of work and contributing to awakening up consciousness for the world. So much love and blessings. Aloha.
Benefit from no ATM fees nationwide with a Columbia Bank Advantage Plus checking account. Use any ATM anywhere nationwide for total convenience. Make any ATM your ATM. For Advantage Plus checking, receive credit up to 10 surcharges or $30 per statement cycle, whichever is less at domestic ATMs not owned by us at charge of transaction surcharge. Maximum rebate of $360 for 12 statement cycles. All offers are subject to be withdrawn at any time. Member FDIC, count on Columbia.